Hello, Maya. Thank you for coming.
Hi, nice to be here.
Before we start, can you maybe explain a little more like what it is that you do for a living?
Yeah. So I would say number one, I'm an executive coach. So I work primarily with businesses. And so I will coach their leaders. And I often do that through like an institution like London Business School or other associate companies. And so they will then put me in touch with their teams or specific programs and I will coach their leaders. That's number one. And then my second piece is research supervisor. So also with London Business School, I'm researching leadership development, and then I supervise research students who are also looking at positive leadership, positive work. So anything in that intersection between positive psychology, leadership, and work and organizational flourishing, that's my sort of research area. And of course, I have then gone specifically into the area of social media and well-being because that then was coming up as something that needed a bit more exploration.
Yeah, and I think people don't pay as much attention to it, or maybe are not aware of the actual effects that social media has on you. Before I jump in social media, um, as I was listening to your podcast, I wanted to ask you one thing about like the research because I also have like I would say scientific background because I finished bachelor's in sports psychology and there's like so many papers to read even when it comes to like one topic. Um what is like your research style or how do you research certain topics? How do you approach it?
Yeah. Well, I actually think a lot of the masters was training in how to do exactly that research, because I don't feel like there's one formula. But my social media and well-being research was a systematic review, and that has actually got me into a more systematic way of doing research, because what you do is you define your search terms and then you do full database searches. And I just think that's quite a rigorous way, because I think it's very easy to just go to Google Scholar, type in your keywords, see the most recent
Yeah.
papers, most cited papers, and that's great. But I think there's a rigor about defining what you're searching for and then seeing what comes up and actually seeing like the number of papers. So I like to do that now as a bit of a discipline, on top of the Google Scholar approach. And also I like to figure out which are in that space, like the most reputable journals, and use that as a starting point as well to kind of make sense of which papers I should be paying more attention to. The final thing that I always like to do, having done my own systematic review research, is I like to look for meta-analyses and I like to look for systematic reviews. And so for the listeners, those are studies which are synthesizing a large number of papers in a space and then coming up with either quantitative effect sizes, or for systematic reviews, kind of, a framework or a scope of what is out there. And I find those really, really useful because, again, they help you find your way. As you said, there's so much out there. Final one is just, the masters, I think, also having the professors and
Yeah.
lecturers, enabled them to kind of highlight what were good reading lists. So I do love a reading list. I
Oh yeah.
think they can't be underrated, they can't be
Yeah, I
overrated.
always
Yeah.
go through them. I remember whenever we would have like let's say we have to write an essay and there's a list of papers to read. And some of my course mates, they're like, "Oh my gosh, I don't know what to write." And I'm like, "Did you read this paper?" Literally, like all the answers are in just like in one paper. They're like, "No, I haven't." And I'm like, "Well, obviously you will not know what to like write or what to talk about because you haven't read the paper." But like, let's say at what point you know that you have come to conclusion when it comes to the research?
I think that's really, really hard. And so what I learned about myself, because I'm quite a social learner, and whereas doing academic research can be quite lonely, you've got to do quite a lot of independent thinking. And so what I realized was that when I'm feeling stuck, I actually need to do more reading, because sometimes I can just want to bounce my ideas off people. And when I'm feeling overwhelmed because I haven't got an answer yet, I allow myself to go back to the research and just find more papers. But you do need to make notes as you go. You do need to highlight as you go. So that's one piece. And then the other bit is I try all kinds of weird things. So I will speak into a microphone about what I know on the subject to kind of see if I've got a story yet, or I will quickly write down what I think the outline is. And then that gives me a sense of like, okay, yeah, you do actually have a bit of a story here in terms of what this research is saying, or you don't, you need to go back and find more, because I think it can be quite easy to just keep reading more and more and not really informing your argument enough. And so I think it's very important to balance the reading with some form of output, whether that's speaking or whether it's just writing, not for academic purposes. And actually, I've got to update a paper for publication, fingers crossed. And my approach there is I'm using the comments section a lot. So it's too overwhelming, to just go straight into the actual paper and write academically. So I'm formulating my arguments in the comments, and that's my first stage. And then I will start to actually construct the sentences that are, the academic sentences.
Yeah, I think even like the scientific language, it's like, whoa, like first, for me, English is not my first language. So I remember even looking back on some of the essays that I was writing in first year, I'm like, oh my gosh, like what, like how did I do that? But like learning that language, I think and it's so scientific. Like even now I have, which is the next topic I will touch on, self-regulation. I have huge book of like self-regulation, and it takes me so long just to read like one page just to understand it fully. And it's like so much information. And so like when it comes to self-regulation, can you maybe define what it is, and maybe what's the difference between like self-regulation and self-control?
Yeah. I wonder if we have the same book, by the way. I've got the Handbook of Self-Regulation by Bowmaster and all. Don't know if that's
Yeah,
what
I
you've
think I have
got
the
as
same
your
one,
book. Yeah.
probably.
So let me start with the distinction between self-regulation and self-control, because I think that's interesting. The way I see self-control is more like self-discipline. So it is being able to exert a will over your, task, and therefore control your behavior, right? The way I see self-regulation in comparison to that is that it includes, and the definition does include self-control. So people who have higher levels of self-control do have higher levels of self-regulation. But there's a recognition that control alone can get depleted. And so you actually want you want the ability to regulate all aspects of your emotional, your attentional, and you could probably say other states as well, physical states as well. And so there's more flexibility in actually then sort of managing your state so that you can achieve your outcomes. And so if I was to give a real life example, if I was talking about, say, not using your phone, let's talk about the digital. So if I've got my phone in front of me and I just sort of say, nope, don't use it, and I keep working, I'm exerting self-control, right? If I say, actually, no, I want to start to regulate myself around this, I would say, okay, so I'm noticing there is a need for me to pick up my phone here. I'm feeling bored with my work. I want an easy fix. I'm aware of that. Okay, what else can meet that need? Maybe I can go for a walk. How else can I meet that need? And I can actually then, not deplete myself. Whereas if I keep repressing that emotion, eventually when the tray of sweets comes along, I'll be like, give me all of them, because I've used up my willpower,
I was
basically.
about to ask you, where
So,
does the willpower come in this equation?
yes. And so I put self-control, self-discipline, and willpower all in one camp. Yeah. And they're not bad. Like they're great things, right? And they're a limited resource, and you probably are very aware of ego depletion, right?
Yeah.
And that depleting effect, and these things can be depleted. Self-regulation is more of a muscle. It incorporates those things, but it's also more flexible. Kind of it is about working with your systems and like addressing your different needs so that you can then manage them. The other thing about self-regulation is that you can build that muscle up, right? So there are lots of studies, academic studies, which show different activities which just over time build your self-regulation. Funny things like exercise is an obvious one, but other funny ones like checking your posture has been correlated with increasing your self-regulation, because you're building awareness, and then you are starting to do more self-monitoring, because self-monitoring is part of the self-regulatory process.
I was also reading like two
now
things.
I'm very open because I know this is an area of interest to you, and so you might say, well, that's funny, but I read this. And I'm open to that because actually I was researching this in a lot of depth probably last year, and so I may well have missed something there, and I'd be open to being
I was about
challenged
to ask you. I read in a book, which was, for me, it makes sense, but also it was interesting. One thing was that in that book, it was more about willpower and how you can train that willpower as a muscle. Pretty much like similar concept. And one thing was meditation, even if it's like 5 minutes a day, which makes sense because you're becoming aware of your thoughts, and you can learn to control your thoughts. Then you can learn to control yourself as well with time. But another one that I found really interesting was like 5 minute relaxation at the end of the day, where you just relax for like 5 minutes. I don't remember exactly what was the explanation behind it, but I'm really curious on your thoughts about if it's something that you would agree or not, if you have read any like science behind it, because for me it was like, wow, I didn't I I like to connect the dots, and in that moment I don't think I was fully able to connect the dots specifically to this one.
Yeah, well, I think it's good to go back to some of the definitions, and I may or may not answer your question, so let me know. Mindfulness has also been defined as the regulation of attention, right? Because mindfulness is not about controlling your attention.
Yeah.
So it's actually about by regulating your attention in mindfulness, you're not everywhere, you're not too broad, and you're also not completely focused. It's a regulated thing, and this is why I love the word regulation, because it's actually about a continual rebalancing that is happening. So when I looked into self-regulation and mindfulness, I was very interested in how closely the two definitions, at one point I was making the argument that they were almost being defined as the same thing. It's just that self-regulation probably happens over a longer period of time than mindfulness, and mindfulness is more focused on attention than necessarily your emotional regulation, which is another component of self-regulation. So I just think it's nice to start there and think about that definition of regulation of attention, self-regulation, and mindfulness. To me, they are all related. And I can totally see, because self-control is one component of self-regulation, I can totally see how that would be strengthened through the practice of meditation. And I guess the question is, control is great, the ability to control our thinking, but at some point that will limit, at some point your ability to control will reach a limit. Whereas if you're able to regulate yourself, it's almost like you can flap in the wind and and be resilient. Whereas if you're having to control, at some point the dam will burst, and that's how I think of the two things differently.
So with the regulation, is it, I don't want to ask if it's like a limited resource, but like the way you explained it, it sounds like when it comes to self-control, you in a way really restrict yourself until you break. But with self-regulation, it's like more flexible in that way.
Yeah. And because self-regulation includes emotional regulation, attentional regulation, and I've also seen definitions that include like our physiological regulation, because our body is in a constant state of regulation as well, with the hormone systems, temperature as well. There are so many aspects of regulation going on just to kind of maintain an equilibrium. And so yeah.
Okay. Can you give any advice when it comes to like emotional control? Because I think there's so many people that, well, first, they're not even aware of their emotions and how much their emotions actually control their actions. And secondly, they just don't know. Like once they are aware, they're like, well, yeah, I get angry at this or that, but I can't control it. They have this like, they are so certain that this is just the way I am. I just can't change it.
Yeah, this is fantastic, because this is what I end up working on a lot with clients. And you would be surprised in leadership roles how important emotional regulation is. It is one of the things that most frequently comes up, especially with my male clients. So it's really interesting. And what we do is we really try and break down the area that they're trying to regulate. And it could be like certain reactions that they're having in meetings. It could be, often it is related to, I guess, some form of loss of control, loss of temper or whatever it is. And emotional regulation, there is a model by Grossman. I think he was one of the main guys who was looking at emotional regulation. And he breaks down the stages. There's a first reaction, and then there's subsequent responses. And that is always really important to kind of share with clients when they're trying to address this, that your first reaction is often your first reaction. Yes, over time you may well, and especially if you're dedicated to the practice of things like meditation, you may well start to even be able to affect that first response. But let's not fixate on that first response. Let's fixate on the follow-up responses, the coping strategies, what's in our toolkit to then manage that response. And that's the secondary, it's almost like your secondary response. That's where it gets really exciting. That's where we've got a lot of control in the short term. So, if you're to your person who says, oh, I can't help it, it's just the way I am, I'll say, yeah, probably your natural state is one where you are more fiery than others, and that has good things and bad things. You might be more sensitive, you might be more excitable, you might be more passionate. All of these things, they might be your traits and things. Just recognizing that then allows you to develop a really good set of strategies to address those reactions. And that's where your regulation comes in. And so then often it becomes about how quick is your recovery? How quickly can we get you back to a good state, a state that allows you to do your work, that is not self-deprecating, because there's often then quite a lot of like rumination and mulling things over, and these are things which really affect my clients, and I'm aware that they're struggling with reverting back to kind of like a normal good state. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, and like even going further, once they have that, let's say they have had this reaction that they didn't want to have, maybe, as I was thinking, it's like it's as if they keep carrying this like situation or emotion with them. So maybe what role does letting go play in this like equation?
Yeah, that is, I mean, I'm actually reading right now Effortless. Find the author's name for you, but it is all about sometimes the letting go being the easier path. And so, Wonderful by Greg McKeown. It's a wonderful, I think you would love it based on what we've talked about so far. But it is all about, in that moment, is there a more effortless path? And letting go is often part of that. But when I'm working one-to-one with people, I don't want to force letting go as the first solution, because I actually think it takes time to get to that point. And I think it can be frustrating initially. if you can't let go. Just like you said, like you're almost frustrated that you got angry in the first place. So it's almost your reaction that you don't want. And I want to normalize the reactions. I want, we'll do personality assessments, so we know that these are likely to be their reactions, and so that's fine, but let's figure out how we work with that.
Yeah. Another thing is that this is more like from my own experiences, how I usually try to explain people when it comes to like regulating your emotions. I was about to say controlling, but I think it's more like regulating. Um, because like I think I have worked on myself and my awareness so long that, let's say if you say something and it triggers me, I am really aware of that. And there's like really small gap where I either decide to act on it or not. And I think the more aware you become of yourself and the more you work on yourself, the bigger that gap gets where you actually can make that decision that actually stop. I will think what I am feeling, what's the emotion, whether it's like worth to actually take this action or it's just me like being impulsive. So like, is there any, I don't know, scientific explanation behind that? Because I haven't looked into like science behind it, but it's something that I have noticed within myself, and also some of my clients have said that they kind of understand that concept when I explain it, and even when they look back and reflect, they are able to see that when it happened, but they are not in a place where they might be able to control it yet, or like be able to change it up.
Yeah. No, there are lots of things that are coming up there for me. There's reflective practice, there's Kahneman, think fast, think slow, and he talks about the experiencing self versus the other selves versus like the reflecting self. And I'm just trying to think with all of the mindfulness literature, because there is so much of it, the extent to which they discuss detachment. I think there is a lot actually around the detaching from emotions, because that is a big part of what you're describing, right? The ability to depersonalize, the ability to separate. And apparently it's only us humans that are able to do this, to get ourselves into this state where we can actually observe our own thinking and say, oh, I'm feeling like this right now. Oh, I'm noticing that I am really triggered by this. So I believe there is a lot of research there, but I can't quote you a paper right now. But I think it's interesting that it also comes up in the reflective practice literature a lot, because that is all about the benefits of whichever practice you choose, increasing that. I'm conscious of the sun, by the way. I'm not sure if I should draw the
Wait, I will
curtain.
pause it. You can change it. Yeah, so where did we leave? I forgot. I was so focused on.
Yeah, so we were just talking about the gap and detachment, and that separation from ourselves, and that ability to create that second response. No, it's a great question, and I'm pretty sure that it's implicit in a lot of this regulation literature as well. And just going back to our example once more about the phone and the way that you would treat the two things differently, the person who's working on their self-regulation would really, their first step is awareness. The first part of the Baumeister, he's got his 4 steps of self-regulation. The first part of that is awareness and monitoring, because you can just push the phone away, but you haven't really addressed your triggers there. You haven't addressed your internal triggers, and so you haven't really done anything to strengthen your responses in the future, and in some ways you've just taxed yourself. And this goes, I mean, you're probably really aware of all of this, but there is so much that can deplete us, right? In our, whether it's like a noise when we're trying to work, or whether it's like a stressful conversation. And so if we rely solely on that ability to control, then we're not, when things get tough and difficult, we're gonna struggle to bounce back. Whereas if we take more of that regulatory approach, it just allows us to listen to our needs more and make sure that we're satisfying some of those needs.
Yeah.
So I think self-regulation also goes hand in hand with coping strategies.
Yeah, like
I think
even
coping
that
strategies is a huge
awareness
part.
where, let's say with depletion, let's say if somebody is wanting to be healthy or make like healthy choices, if you know that if you go to shop in the evening where you have like you're pretty much run out of your energy, then you probably will make less good choices. And I think being aware of those things and then adjusting your actions accordingly. Like usually the way I describe awareness is that if you were in a dark room and I would throw you a ball, like you wouldn't be able to catch it. Like you just can't see it. But then like once you switch the light on, like you can see the ball and you can catch it. So it's the same with like self-awareness. Like you can't really change behaviors that you're not even aware of or that you don't notice. And like I know it's been helpful for me to just reflect a lot. Like let's say when it comes to training, if I know that I don't have any results, I have to sit down and reflect, and then I see, well, actually I just didn't put as much in. Or like when it comes to work, or when it comes to like my self-development or certain things that I work on, I'm like, well, and like a lot of times which is another interesting thing, that where like with what I was reading about habit tracking and uh, becoming aware of like your execution with habits, because I think many times people are like, well, I am doing my habits, but you don't actually know how many of them you do. So let's say out of 2 weeks you might do like 5 days. It's already more than you usually do. So you're like, well, actually I'm doing pretty good, like I'm being like consistent with my habits, but I have no results. But like you don't have the data to actually show how much you execute or how much you don't execute. And what I was reading is that a lot of times we think that we are doing better than we actually are, and that's where it's important that you have some kind of data come in that you can actually see that, okay, this week I did only like, I don't know, 2 days out of 5, and then you're not surprised for not getting results. Otherwise you feel like, well, I'm actually taking some action but I don't get results, and then you get like frustrated and then you quit. So like that's
Yeah, I
something that
love
I have
that.
seen.
Yeah, I love that. So what you're saying is that often we don't have a full picture when we think something's not succeeding because we haven't tracked it. We've just gone on, what we think we're doing. And this relates a lot to my nutrition partner who I used to do my podcast with. And, her first thing is always like, you need to do a food diary and when you do the food diary, I need to know how much water you're actually drinking. And most of the time people don't know how much water they're actually drinking.
No.
And same with screen time. So I've recently been coaching people on their deep work and distraction. And one of my clients said to me, oh, my habits with the phone are shocking. And I was like, okay, what is the screen time saying? How many pickups are you doing? So I don't know, actually. I didn't even know that was there. And that's not a bad thing. But for me, the first step is raising our awareness of the habit by putting some metrics around it. And then also just your analogy of, the supermarket when you're tired or hungry or whatever. And the same thing for me with the phone is that, if I happen to have a phone with me in the bedroom before bed, which I sometimes do because my meditation app is on there. So I have a bit of I haven't resolved this yet,
Yeah.
but I can suddenly find myself
Maybe you can
just
play it in
mindless.
different room.
Yeah. I don't, the only thing I've managed to do is Bluetooth headphones.
Yeah, I was about to
So
say
getting
that.
the Bluetooth headphones. Yeah. That requires all it requires is a conversation like this,
Yeah.
because often we just need to do that little conversation and we've got a quick fix that
Yeah.
was pretty much almost there, but we hadn't quite put it into practice.
Yeah.
So now that we've had that conversation, there's no excuses. But if I have found myself with it in the bedroom, then I will see that I'm mindless, because at that hour I'm on it. In the morning, I'm not mindless, and I'm actually nowhere near my phone. So again, like you said, knowing when you're depleted. And the other thing is that when clients say to me, oh, I'm a bit lazy, and I say, well, I don't think you're lazy. I think you're just depleted, because most of us know when we are just anything's possible, we can accomplish anything. And then there are other times when everything feels hard. And to me, it's just, that's one of those energy management things. So,
Is that
yeah.
like a way how to, well, sounds aggressive, but like push through those times when you feel depleted, but you have to perform like, or maybe have you helped any of your clients with that when they have this like really important period when they are really depleted, but they have to perform at their best? Like what's like the best way to approach that kind of situation?
Yeah, I mean, that is actually hard because often things will fall away then. So they will then not turn up for their coaching. I mean, it's not often that I have no shows, but we will try and schedule the coaching so that it doesn't fall during those crazy periods. Because the clients that I have, they will get really, really busy. And I have full empathy that during those periods, I'm not going to say to them, look, keep doing your exercise, keep doing sleep, because I've been in that position myself when it's small kids, work, in my case, also doing the masters. And it was just like, look, I am struggling to find 20 minutes in the day to do exercise. So my first thing is that I try and make sure that in those periods, we say, look, let's treat this as a limited window and let's do damage limitation. Yeah. As the first thing, if we can do more, great. But let's just start with, we don't need here to be doing all of our best stuff. Right. And then it will just be really simple things like, can you do one phone call as a walk? Can you pick one other thing that you from your coping toolbox? Because I do spend a lot of time with clients figuring out what's in their toolbox for coping strategies. Can you do one other one of those things that because actually when we develop the coping toolbox and their strategies for this, I do always say to them, do you think you can do this on your worst day, in your worst week? Because that's always my test with my clients. I'm quite cynical in that way. I want the things that we agree on, I want them to be easy, and I want them to be the things that they can even do when things go crazy, because it's all great when life is normal, right? But for a lot of them, their normal is actually not that normal. Like actually their normal is a big wave coming and things are crazy. So I want to make sure that what we're agreeing is stuff that is going to be viable even then, if you know what I mean. So
I think like in a way it can even
like a
help
little
them
thing.
to still feel that sense of control even during that time if they're able to do this like one thing.
Yeah. So one, like a very simple one thing was like, after your presentation, they'll tell me, I said to them, what's your routine after your presentation that you'll do? They'll say, oh, well, normally I will get out for a quick walk, or I'll go and chat to a colleague, or I'll, whatever their normal is. Okay. So, well, within that, so you're going to do the same thing, but can you now also just also say 3 things that went well? Yeah. So you're just being grateful for 3 things. So it doesn't change. They're not having to do anything new. They're still going to have a conversation with their colleague. They're still going to go for a walk. They're still going to do their planner, but they're just going to add those things in. So that would be a very simple thing that is, like you said, that little bit of control, because we're
Like
not trying to
any,
do.
like as you were speaking, you said about like 3 things that happened. Is there like any kind of where I was thinking if there's a place where not sports psychology, the positive psychology can come in and actually add to those like times when you have this like intense schedule.
Yeah. Well, there a lot of the PPIs, which are the positive psychology interventions, and we actually tested a lot of these, on ourselves when we were particularly stressed. So I feel like I know which ones are doable and not doable when you're really up against it, which is often when you're doing a master's, it's at your worst. But 3 good things is from positive psychology, right? And that is a hugely well-known one because it links into gratitude, as we know, is like, everyone's mad for gratitude now, and rightly so. It is an incredible way of rewiring. But what I love are the derivations of 3 good things. So the one that I've been talking about recently, and some of my research students have been using in their academic studies and research, is 3 funny things. So what you do is, and this is for organizations, is you share 3 funny things that have happened that day or that week. And it's tapping into humor, which is another area that has been looked into now, is underutilized, but can trigger all the good positive emotions, broaden and build lightness. And so I think that's really fresh. Like, I've been talking about 3 good things for a long time, but I think it's really fresh to have a humor intervention that is really practical, because we all probably think we could benefit from laughing more, but what in practice, what is it that you can do? And what I love about that, so I've put that one into practice. What I love about that one is that just like with three good things, you start to be on the lookout for the good things during the day. You naturally, your seeking system goes to these things. And just like that with the three funny things, you start to be on the lookout for funny things. And so
Yeah.
it just changes your outlook. And so there's a rewiring going on there. But there's loads of other interventions from positive psychology
I
that
think
we
like with
could
the
think about. I mean,
humor.
so savoring.
Yes, again.
Pardon?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, like the savoring intervention. So like going for 20-minute walks and savoring. I love those, because anything that is sort of to do with nature, and savoring is an area that is explored a lot in positive psychology. And to me, it is actually a form of positive regulation. So positive self-regulation, because the natural response may be to rush through the experience, but by savoring, you are intentionally putting yourself into that positive state and experiencing those positive aspects of whatever you're doing. That's a form of regulation. That's a form of self-regulation. And this is why maybe you and I both love self-regulation, because grit is also a form of self-regulation. So like the
Yeah.
definition in that handbook of grit is basically like extended self-regulation over time in the face of obstacles,
Yeah.
and so this is why I keep coming back to self-regulation in positive psychology.
Yeah, I think like even like from my own experience, I think like even taking responsibility for where you are and then taking action towards like changing it, you when you work on yourself and controlling yourself, regulating yourself. I usually use control because that's usually what people can understand better. Like not many people are aware of the word like self-regulation. And like when
Yeah.
you learn to do that, when you are in control of yourself, you feel more confident because you know that you can deal with certain situations, or like even like you start to trust yourself more as well, that you can actually handle this. And that's something that I have seen within myself, and I tell everybody, it's like, okay, if you're not happy with, let's say, your relationship, work on yourself first. And getting control of yourself, your emotions and things like that, because I had a conversation with one of my clients who is working on emotions, and I said to her like, we are both having conversation and we have no arguments. So a lot of times it takes one person to have good communication, because then you might talk to somebody else and you might feel angry. So like it's one person that's changing, but a lot of times it's enough to have one person to have good communication. Like even myself, I don't even remember when is the last time when I would be like arguing with somebody and being like all like shouting and everything is like flying around. Like I have never had that kind of experience, and it's not because um I don't have emotions. It's more because I learned to maybe, which is another thing I would want you to talk about, is to deal with my ego, maybe set my ego aside several times when it's like something triggers me and I'm like, well, maybe that is true. So why would I have to go and attack somebody back for something that they said that it's true? Maybe the way they said it wasn't accurate or it wasn't nice, but I can't really tell them it's not true because deep down I know it's true. So like working with ego, I think it's so important. And like maybe you have any tips, or maybe what's the importance of working with ego, or what's the role that ego plays and how you can actually kind of learn to get that ego in control.
Yeah. It's interesting that you've used the word control there for the ego, right? Whereas what I would, I think what you're saying is very important, and it's very easy to to get caught back up in the ego, right? Like I noticed that with myself, and so then how do you bring yourself back? And one of the things that, this is more from a personal perspective, is just reconnecting to purpose, because purpose is hopefully not just about you, right? It's about how you want to impact other people, and the positive change that you want to be able to facilitate in the world. And so to me, that alone just puts you into a different space. So that's one kind of simple thing. The other one that I have been practicing more, because I had and my own podcast conversation with someone who sort of specializes this in outdoor intelligence. So making sure that when you do your walks, so for a lot of us, those have become very vital, those, walks during lockdown, etc. But when you're doing that, to have some time that is purely connecting with nature. And in my coaching, I do a lot of systemic coaching. So within the organization, what is the system you're part of? How do you work with that system rather than just on your own? Recognizing that we are all like the product of a system, and that I would even actually go as far as to say, because positive psychology is now saying that perhaps they've got to become too individualized, and it's almost too much pressure on the self for self-development. And so actually recognizing that we're part of a wider system can take that pressure off ourselves. It can mean that it doesn't mean that you therefore sit back and do nothing, but you figure out what you can influence within that, how you can work with the system, and therefore it's kind of better for everybody. And so just then coming back to your thing about ego, just that 10 minutes in nature being part of the system, again, I think is another physical way, quite an embodied way of kind of getting out of your normal thinking, which might become increasingly ego driven as the day goes on, and just reconnecting with that wider system that you're part of. And as I'm saying that, I'm remembering one of my favorite meditations on this Aura app. And it literally at night, it helps you kind of dissolve your layers away of the day. And one of those layers is your ego. And it actually talks about dissolving that and dissolving your to-dos. And so I really enjoy engaging with all of those practices. There was something else that you mentioned when it came to ego. I can't remember now.
I think when it comes to ego, many times, like even what I have noticed is that even when you mention like that the people are being really individualized or things like that, I think it's important to understand that even like becoming less focused or like self-centered, that pretty much like the world is like circling around you and like you're at the center of like the world and things like that. Another thing I think that comes in mind is expectations, and like maybe you can explain the link between like ego and expectations, because I believe there is some kind of link. Because let's say when you expect people to treat you a certain way or do certain things for you, you have this like ego that like you're supposed to treat me this way, but it doesn't mean that you actually deserve or have earned this kind of treatment.
Yes. And that does connect to the other point I really wanted to make as you were talking. So let me just make that point and see if that even starts to address what you're talking about. So the other thing when it comes to relationships and ego and how other people's behaviors affect us and vice versa, is that often as part of this sort of tendency we have to personalize, we interpret other people's actions towards us as, deliberately towards us, whereas actually it's a manifestation of them. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So I just think that plays into this conversation as well, because most of the time, if you are consistent, right, if you have your boundaries about how you operate, you've chosen, listen, I'm always going to be, these are my boundaries. This is how I want to operate in the world. I want to be fair. These are my values. This is how I want to treat people. This is how this is how I am going to go forth in the world. If you are consistently like that, but you then get an individual that is sort of, hurting you in some way or kind of causing some discomfort in your mind, the chances are they are in pain or they are in some form of conflict with themselves, right? And so just recognizing that and saying, hold on, I haven't really probably done anything here particularly, but I'm experiencing this, from this individual. I think that can be really powerful. And then, in those situations, I don't think one should just absorb, because it's really, like this is something that they look at in positive psychology as well, to say, listen, positivity is not always appropriate. right? In domestic abuse, for example, positivity, forgiveness, all of these things, they are not appropriate. The emotions of anger and other negative emotions have a very, very important function, right? So I'm not saying that you just absorb somebody else's misery because, and you take it for them, but just appreciating why you are experiencing some of that from their actions can just help you in the way you navigate those relationships. And either it can help to normalize because they like, okay, well, this person is always fair and they can go through their own journey. And when they've gone through their journey, they may well be like, oh, great, this person was always consistent in there and fair and decent to me. Or maybe they never will, and it's not for you to control. But so anyway, I just wanted to put that out there because that does come up a lot. Like I often am coming in when people are having very problematic relationships at work, or there could be, a personal relationship, but probably where I see it more is in the workplace. And if I have had, say, 2 or 3 sessions with a client and they've got a problematic relationship in the workplace, and after 3 sessions, the pattern is still very strongly demonstrating itself, the chances are that like 6 months on, that person that they're working with is no longer in the organization. Because, and this is based on literally my experience of many, many different clients, is that often it's because they're working with a very difficult character, and that difficult character is going through their own difficulties and is actually not going to survive in the organization. So I think it can be very helpful to remember when we experience negative stuff from others, that it's probably because of their own internal pain.
Yeah, I think
I just wanted to throw that in there.
I think it's also important to keep in mind that has been really helping me when it comes to communication, that there's a reason why people act a certain way. A lot of times it has nothing to do with you. That's like, even like when somebody gets angry, that might be just a coping mechanism that they have learned that actually works for them. It doesn't have to do like anything with you. And like, even like a bit of detachment as well, where to be able to maybe detach a bit emotionally from that like situation as it's happening. I think it takes a lot of practice to get to that place, but I know that for me it's been helpful to first check within myself how I feel, if there's something that they say that is triggering me, and then like work with that as they are speaking or shouting, whatever they are doing. But also as they speak, listen if whatever they are saying, let's say, if that's actually relevant, if that's actually true. So let's say, oh, if I don't wash my dishes and you shout at me, well, that's like, it's pretty much a fact. So I can't really argue back at that. Maybe I can argue on the way they deliver the message, but the message is pretty much true. But if it's not true, then I would probably work towards understanding whether I'm understanding it wrong, or maybe in my perception it's not true, but it's actually true in their perception. And I think and I had a conversation in the previous episode about that it's important, let's say in a relationship, when you argue, actually make sure that you understand the person right, instead of assuming, I know what you're thinking, you are this way, and things like that.
Yeah. And as you're saying that, I'm also thinking that one of the best things that you can do in the situation that you described is just say, I'm noticing that you're really angry here. I'm noticing that your reaction is actually making me, quite stressed here. And that, I mean, to get to that point it's not going to happen overnight, but it's even before you've
I think like even
Astra
telling them that you are being
herself.
angry, I think you can just trigger them even more if you point out that you're being angry.
You can, or you could say, look, I'm noticing you're upset here. Yeah. Right. So it comes from more of a place of empathy, because actually anger is often just, people have sort of, lost control of their emotions, and they're feeling rage. And so they actually deserve, I mean, I say this because I have a 4-year-old. So when it comes to him, he's been my biggest teacher, because so actually this is another thing that plays in here, is with the chimp paradox has been a very useful book, both in managing my son and also for my clients. They found it really helpful. So the chimp paradox, if you've not come across it, is a great book. Read it. And it does actually, you have you?
Yeah.
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 And again, it goes into, you were talking before about ego and the different types of the brain and things like that, or how we detach ourselves. And I find that the chimp piece can be really, really useful way of detaching. So, I would say to my son, okay, so your chimp seems really upset right now. What does your chimp need? And he really relates to that. I think maybe as when you're young, you can be quite visual, or you've got a good imagination, so it really makes sense to him. But it works for clients as well, because they're like, oh, I understand now why they are, this person always gets triggered and acts out now. It's, you're like, I can see how their chimp is reacting, then how my chimp reacts to their chimp. And so because when somebody's chimp goes, then the other person's chimp gets activated as well. So it's like, in your angry dishwashing conversation, it's like, I can see that your chimp is out right on that about these dishes, and actually that is now triggering my chimp. And so I'm not saying that this is always going to be a possible conversation, but just where it is, or even being able to articulate these things in ourselves, it can be really helpful before we even try and solve a problem. It can diffuse things, it can diffuse the problem. So that's what I advocate first, because then the situation is very hard to know what was going on in the situation, what triggered them to be angry, what's gone on. But just to be able to say, I can see that you're upset, and actually that's making me now, that alone often is not said
Yeah.
in tricky conversations. And when it is, it can bring a lot more awareness into that conversation and make it a more productive conversation.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like, even like, I think what you said about the chimp, I think one really big thing that it's helping with is to kind of take out the I of equation, where it's not like me, where you don't take it as personally. You're just like, this is the chimp. It's not like me, it's the chimp side of me. So that's when you are able to make, and when you tell it to somebody else, they're like, oh, that's my chimp. Like it's like you don't maybe offend them as much, or maybe not trigger them as much, because they're aware that, okay, this is just a chimp. It's not like me at the core who is like me. And like, another thing I wanted to ask you, as you were speaking, was there's really thin line, I think, between um, emotional, like regulating your emotions and suppressing them. So like, how you distinguish them, or how you maybe um, make sure you don't suppress the emotions, because I think that's when it doesn't get any better, when you start like suppressing them.
Yeah. And this goes back to, that thing in the wind, the tree in the wind versus just being pushed and pushed and pushed, and then at some point it snaps, right? um so actually, the kind of the more expressive, slightly louder, more angry person, they might actually be fine. And it's the quiet, absorbing people who at some point might just snap, right? Because they are used to kind of absorbing, but at some point they might snap. So um this is, to me, this is the heart of control versus regulation. Is that there is, with control, there is some form of suppression going on. You're overriding something. Whereas in regulation, you allow that need to be felt, experienced, and heard. And then you decide what the course of action is. And so you meet the need. And that's the critical difference. So obviously we may we may want to do a bit of both, but if we only control and suppress, then at some point we might explode. Whereas if we keep regulating, we're continuously in some form of balance, even if we at any point are kind of in a, more of a flux.
One thing that I have learned myself with emotions was, maybe you can speak a bit more on this, is that like, you want to feel emotions, but you don't want to identify with them. So let's say if I'm feeling down and I'm crying, all the thoughts that come in my head, and it took me a while to learn this, they come in my head, but I don't identify with them, because the moment I start identifying with them, it just goes down. Like, I just get even worse and I cry more, and then those thoughts trigger more crying. But then, like, once I approached it more like a detox process. Okay, I feel emotional. I want to cry. I cry it out. I just let it go, and I just move on with my day like instantly. So like how to like is there any, I don't know, science behind it, or is that something that's like, I don't know if common, or um, because I know that it has been really helpful for me, just that shift towards how I perceive those like emotions.
Yeah. Well, I would say this is the heart of mindfulness, right? Because it's the ability to become more aware of what you're feeling without identifying it, raise your ability to notice. And you're exactly right, like it doesn't happen overnight, but over time you can start to do that. So in my case, some really simple practices. I listen to this Aura app before bed, and don't get me wrong, sometimes I just conk out when I put it on.
Yeah.
I haven't done any meditation, but other times I really value that shift in state. And another one is I haven't been drinking alcohol, and so that's been about, I think it's been like more than 100 days now that I haven't had any alcohol. But I am massively aware of these things going on in my head. Like every Thursday night, it's like, time for a drink, Maya. But I don't identify with it anymore. It's just like, it just comes, and I watch it and I'm like, oh, well, that's quite funny. And like, I don't actually, exactly as you said, I don't get sucked in by it. I just notice it, because apparently, and this addiction is fascinating, and it is obviously related to self-regulation as well. So people with higher self-regulation, and they're going to be less susceptible to addiction, and that's in the research. There's a lot of correlations there. But with addiction, you have these cravings, and craving is your neural pathways wanting to be reinforced. And actually, the fact that you've got the craving means that they are worried about not being reinforced. So they could, at that moment, that is your moment, right?
Yeah.
Having the craving is not the bad thing. Having the craving is actually a sign that you are going to be like, your neural pathway wants to be reasserted, right? And your decision then is like, do you reinforce the grooves, or do you manage to sidestep those through a mixture of methods: distraction, coping, mindfulness, all of the practices that are in your toolkit for doing that. Anyway, we might be going off on a tangent there, but I do think it's
No, I don't
interesting how
mind it.
all of these things are related.
Even like
And
with the,
I just think,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, no, and self-regulation is at the heart of them, right? It's in the middle of, the way we emotionally regulate with others, and on the other side, our, ability to be addicted or not addicted to things, and notice how our patterns then unfold. And so
Yeah.
if we are then trying to change a habit, exactly as you said, to be able to disidentify from some of the feelings that come up when we're trying to change those, is going to give us so much more power to affect those.
Another thing that I noticed one time when I was in gym, I think it was before all the lockdowns. I was even starting to play games where, let's say I'm about to do the last set, and I have this voice in my head being like, yeah, but you already did all you had to do, like just take a day off, not like day off, but like just leave it there. And I would literally be like telling myself, is that all you have? Like, is that your only argument? So in a way, you start to play those games with yourself. And which is another thing that I wanted to mention earlier about like humor, where like I think it's, even when I work with my clients, a lot of times it's, I try to introduce them with idea to be able to even like laugh at themselves and have fun while they are growing, because you don't have to beat yourself up for like where you are. You can actually enjoy the process, and you can learn along the way and have fun as you do it. And you will get results either way, but the difference is that as you get towards those results, you can feel miserable, or you can actually have fun and enjoy it.
This is why I think you're going to love this book, Effortless. It is such a revelation, because, I have to say that I'm probably quite hard. Like, I work too hard. I mean, I'm quite good about balance. Like, so then at the, I know my cutoff, and I've always sort of balanced life, but, just, I've always felt like, yeah, like put the work in. And this book is all about taking like whatever you decide is essential and then making that fun and effortless and joyful, and pairing it perhaps with like a treat. So, you know, you're doing your treadmill, but you're listening to your favorite podcast. I mean, some of it's simple stuff, we know, but I mean, I think wrapped up in like a lot of these self-help books are all going to be, you know, similar concepts of the moment, wrapped up in different ways, and they're going to appeal to us at different times. So this has come for me at just the right time when I was just thinking, I just feel like I'm putting a little bit too much effort in to everywhere, you know, and I just need life to feel a bit lighter. So I think, like you said, if you can make some of those processes feel more wonderful, then all the better. And so one of the things he talks about is ritual, and he defines ritual as habits with soul. And so the idea is that if you're going to do some of these practices, which you know are kind of your essential practices, if you can infuse them with soul and things that are essentially you, then that process can be really joyful. So like I think about my morning routine. So, you know, hands up, haven't been waking up at 5 a.m. for the last couple of weeks, but generally I am in the 5 a.m. club, and it's when I get my deep work done. And I'm quite proud of that those morning rituals. And they really do feel like rituals now. They're quite slow, and there's like the making the coffee, and it's just a very specific time of the day, and the teeth brushing, washing your face, like even just washing your face and putting your creams on and stuff like this all become a bit of a ritual for me, and the pace of it. And so I really relate to that idea that, and I know that basically once I've gone through that ritual, I have set myself up for 2 hours of like the best work of the day that is going to happen. But it has felt, because of maybe it's all about the coffee, you know, because it's got this amazing coffee in it. It's something that I look forward to, you know, in the morning. So yeah.
I think I don't really drink coffee, but for me, it's really similar, where even just thinking about getting up, making my bed, brushing teeth, that's like the first few triggers that I have of like waking up. And like even I recently rejoined the 5 a.m. club. And even like I started 5 a.m. when I was like 10 years old. I was just like waking up and doing my own workouts. But recently when I rejoined, one thing that I noticed, so like every day I would post a story that I'm up at this time. But then I noticed that it was starting to disturb my sleep, because I was like, oh my gosh, I can't oversleep because I have to post this picture. And like usually my mornings are offline, where my phone is like on airplane mode. You can't reach me for like, I don't know, until like 8 or 9. And that's something that was really disturbing my morning. So that's when I was like, okay, I will stop posting. I still gonna do it, but I'm stopping to post it, because that was just making it not enjoyable the way I enjoyed to do it, where you wake up and there's like no distractions. It's just like, and another thing is that nobody's up. So you're just by yourself. Everything is quiet. Nobody's like messaging you, bombarding you with messages. It's so amazing. I really enjoy like early mornings, because that's when pretty much I usually set myself up for the day. And I feel, and also the time is passing by much slower, because you have way less distractions, like pretty much no distractions.
I'm so with you, and I'm pleased that I love the way you refer to it. It's like I've rejoined the club, and it's as if we both know about this 5 a.m. club, and you know, whereas actually we haven't really talked about it before. But you know, so even more recently, for me, it's been 6, and so even when I get that 1 hour and 15 minutes, like you said, because time goes so slowly, then that it's still worth it. Like I still feel so much better by the afternoon in terms of where I am on my tasks and things. So I'm with you there. And then you have also there touched on the other interesting topic, which is this sort of interaction between social media and this, you know, self-regulation life that we're also trying to cultivate, and the way they interact. So I think you've touched on something very interesting there. And you know, like you said, the morning is free of a lot of those distractions, and you, I guess, notice that in trying to you know, do that story or whatever, you obviously had the awareness that wasn't really then working with your values, or what you wanted the morning to be about, right? So I
Yeah.
think that's a great example of like experimenting and then adjusting. And that's how you and I first connected, right? On Clubhouse, where
Yeah.
you were talking about having a process and then evaluating. And what I love about when you mention that, so I had asked a question about when you're first starting on a new platform, so I think we were talking about video there and
Yeah.
YouTube, and I was saying you just a bit demoralizing because you're like right at the beginning of it, and how do you be basically?
Yeah.
And you were saying, well, why don't you just focus on the process, right? And actually, going back to what you were saying about processes being joyful, i I enjoy creative aspects of social media. Like, I have a natural, I know some people, they just hate all of that, but I actually like that. So
Yeah.
focusing on the process is not a bad thing. I like writing, I like coming up with captions, I like sharing what I consider to be either useful research or insights. I love all of that. So just what you said there about turning that into a process, and then that being your measure, not outputs tomorrow kind of thing, or reactions or whatever it is meant to be tomorrow, but more of a long-term thing, I think was really valuable. So just getting diverted there, but like just wanted to relate this
Because like it's
conversation.
something that I also had myself. Like before I posted my first post, like recently, I think like a few months ago, about this podcast, I didn't post. The last post I had was like September 2019. I didn't post at all. I was like, I just want to have my private life. But then I understood that one shift that I had in my mind was that I started to just see it as like it's just a part of my job description. I have to put myself out there. It's nothing personal. It's just part of the job. I have to appear on social media. Um, and like even from that, I got like awesome connections, even with yourself. Because like when you were asking that question, I'm like, wow, you actually like within that question, I'm like, you do a lot of research. I could just hear that you do a lot of research. And I'm like, okay, I have to have a conversation with you or have you on because like even the way you would formulate the questions, I could instantly see that you're somebody who is like really well educated, but also curious on like certain things that maybe many people might not even think about, which is pretty much the way I am. I'm always like really curious about like so many things. Really like to understand like human nature, and like I've been in self development for like 10 years now, and I just keep testing things out. So like let's say when it comes to early mornings, um or like social media, I know that I want to motivate people, I want to inspire people. That's pretty much the only reason why I am on social media, is to add value to other people. But if it is getting in my way of me moving ahead or me enjoying that time with myself, then there's a point where I have to stop doing that. Not in a way where I completely stop social media, but like this
Yeah,
specific action that
I
I
think
wake
you've
up in the
just
morning.
you just cut out there for 1 minute. I
Okay.
I didn't quite
So
hear the
like
end of what
so
you
like
said.
usually in the mornings, like if that posting daily in the morning would get in pretty much disrupt my feeling of peace, then I'm like, okay, I have to stop as much as I want. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want others to perceive that I'm quitting or this and that. But then I was like, at some point, you just have to set that aside and you have to put yourself first and your wants and needs first. It doesn't mean that I'm stopping it, but I'm just stopping to post about it because that was just for my own health. Because I really enjoy having even like several hours offline, let's say from 5 to 9, just completely offline, where you just can't text me, you can't reach me, and I don't see any messages. Because if I wake up in the morning and I see some messages, I will think about them. Even if I'm not responding, I will think about them. Um, and like maybe you can talk about some of the research you have done with the social media and well-being, because I think it's so important, especially nowadays where first off, there's no 9 to 5 job anymore. You're on your phone all day. And there's like even like today I was reading some comments with people telling that about their challenges with like working from home, and there's like family, and some are like, oh, I have a lot of people around, or somebody's like, I have nobody around. And then a lot of like distractions and how you deal with distractions when you have so many things. So maybe you can ex- just jump in your research that you have done, because I know you have done a lot of research about like this topic.
Yeah, yeah. And there was so much that you said there that I wanted to pick up on. So just going back to what you were saying about how actually you realized social media is part of your job. And I just wanted to make the connection between that and what we were talking about earlier when it came to sort of ego and being able to detach ourselves, because there is this risk with social media that we over identify with it. And yet, yes, we can express our identities, definitely. And the research showed this. A lot of papers found that it could help us express our personal narratives, help with self-expression, different forms of identity development. So it can be really powerful like that. But what you're doing by identifying that it's just part of your job description means you can actually professionalize this, and you can schedule when you're going to use it, how you're going to use it, and you can detach from it. And so I just like the parallel here. And this is why I think all of these conversations are very related, that, being able to depersonalize your kind of job aspects there means that you can be more consistent and not have the emotional reactions. And I was just having a conversation this week with a friend who sort of said, look, I've just got kind of too overwhelmed by it all. And she knows that she needs to do it as part of her job because everybody in her industry does it. And I think it can be very easy to kind of get confused, because it's like we're all expected to do our own marketing today, right? Because social media is so easy. We're all expected to be marketeers now. Whereas, in the past, you would have said, well, actually, that's not my skill set, and I may need some help and support with the marketing aspect of my business, for example. But now it's so easy. It's almost like you've got to do it. But setting the right boundaries around it is very important. That's also that ties in with the research. So the research was looking at kind of optimal amounts of time, which were good for well-being. So it was in that 20 to 30 minute window of time per day. 0 was not helpful, because then you're disconnected. It was only helpful for people who were sort of addicted or had problematic relationships. But there's so much in the research. I think for the purposes of this conversation, the things that stand out are around this. It links in with what we've talked about when it comes to self-regulation. So building up our autonomy and building up our self-regulation means that we can better manage ourselves. So to me, getting to a place where you can do mindful scrolling when you go online, and when you go on, you remember why you went onto your phone, and you remember why you did the instruction, like you remember why you took the action, and you go away and actually do that action. That is an achievement, today, given all the distractions. These to me are actually really great forms of feedback, because to me, just like we were describing with alcohol, to me, really mastering a relationship with alcohol is not full abstinence, because that's almost the easy bit. The difficult bit is the reintegration of it, and how you manage that, and if you can do that well. And likewise, I think the real trick with social media is, yes, definitely go and have your breaks when you're creating. So when I was doing my thesis, I was like, I just didn't use it, and it's like, it's fine, who cares? But to me, the real art is actually getting like very good with your self-regulation and your mindfulness and your self-awareness when you use these technologies. That to me is like the growth journey, and the evidence, the research papers looked at how that impacts your well-being when you go online, and there's a really interesting relationship there, especially in the workplace. So higher levels of mindfulness are linked to well-being effects from social media, whereas lower mindfulness levels are linked to burnout. So again, it's all connected, and I could go into it in more detail, but I'm also conscious of time now. But I hope that like starts to touch on some of the different things that are relevant when it comes to social media and digital well-being.
With the social media, is it and well-being, is well-being better when you have no social media, or having some social media can actually benefit with that like well-being?
Yeah. So the studies, that's what the study showed. The study showed that zero social media reduced well-being
Okay.
because it cut off connection. And then it was the limiting it was improved well-being, apart from those that had a more problematic relationship with social media. For them,
Okay.
complete abstinence did increase their well-being. And there were other benefits as well. So like things like misinformation and this political polarization, they also improved when it was limited
Mm-hmm.
or reduced. So I was actually really interested by these studies about abstinence, because it did show that complete abstinence did not improve well-being.
Yeah, I had a time when I think it was like 2 years ago where I pretty much had like no social media. I decided to take some time off, and it wasn't just that I had the apps on the phone, I just deleted them. So I had pretty much the only thing I had was, I think you also mentioned that in Clubhouse conversation, that WhatsApp isn't seen as social media. So pretty much the only app that I had left was WhatsApp. And it was really interesting because at some point I just didn't feel the need for my phone. It was amazing feeling because I was able to actually be more present and get more done. But like at this point, it's pretty much like part of my job, so I still have to be on social media. But I'm not in a place where I was like, I would say like almost 4 years ago, where I would like post and I would always be there, or like check the likes and things like that, because then I'm just checking it. I'm not really creating as much. But now I'm more in a place where I work towards checking it less, but and like even when you create a lot of content, you don't even have time to check all the time as well, which is another thing that I have noticed.
I love that content creation versus just checking. Yeah, I like the distinction. And for some of us, we want to be more on the creation side, and that's actually feeds us. And that is where there is, creativity, and there's the good things. And, I still want to be able to engage. I always say, like, it's really important that's how you have a sense of community,
Yeah.
right? You can't just push out content.
Yeah, like that's
But
usually what
yeah,
I
the
do. Like
distinction between the
I
two.
don't in with checking, I meant that I don't check like how many followers, how many likes, and like those kind of things that I can't really control them. But pretty much the only use that I see for social media for me, or what I'm trying to implement in my life, is to use it to connect with people or to add value, like those two things mainly.
Yeah.
Not as much just to consume it for, unless that's something that I want to do, or there's certain things that I'm looking for, then okay. But otherwise, just to consume some, for me, not helpful content, I work towards avoiding that.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe you can tell people where they can find you, or if there's anybody interested to hear more about what you do, how you work, and things like that.
Yeah. So the first thing is I have the Golden Hour podcast. And that you can go on to Apple or whichever, Spotify, and just type in the Golden Hour with Maya. And there I'm looking at these subjects. So I'm looking at, how we connect online, while managing well-being. I'm also looking at aspects of work, but the main thing I'm doing is like, how do you create a daily ritual around deep work time? And if you can make that good, then you can make everything good. So it's everything around, like, focused around that subject. And then you can find me on social media at Maya Gudka, so MayaGudka. That's on Twitter and Instagram. And yeah, I've been enjoying Clubhouse as well, so you can find me there. It's like enjoying learning from all the different conversations on Clubhouse.
Yeah, awesome. I will link all that below as well. Well, thank you for coming. This conversation was amazing. And I was really looking forward to it. And it's like, it's obvious why after having this conversation.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed talking to you, Ostra, and I have to say, I just love your energy. It's so calm, and I think it's incredible when that translates even through like the Zoom screen, where you can actually feel somebody's positive energy. So thank you
Well,
so
thank
much for
you.
sharing that with
Thank
me.
you. Well, thank you for coming. Hopefully I get you another time.